friends. I'm very pleased and happy to welcome you tonight to this first online lecture of the side program of our exhibition Iran, Art and Culture from 5 Millennia. The exhibition has been organized by the Museum für Islamische Kunst in Berlin and the Sarihani Collection, and I am Ute Franke from the museum and curator of the exhibition. Now, today's lecture is dedicated to the theme of early cities in Iran, to be followed in the coming weeks, each Thursday at the same time at 6:30 p.m. German time, by further lectures on modern art in Iran, on Kashad, crossroads of commerce and culture, the rituals of Zoroastrians from antiquity to the present day, and Iranian gardens once and now. You can see in the chat on the upper line, you can see the link which leads you to the program where you have an overview and short abstracts of these lectures. I would like to thank and express my sincerest gratefulness to my colleagues who are working in the background and who took care of the organization, dissemination, and technical implementation of the events. It was not always very easy. These are Sina Epton, who just spoke to you, Maximilian Hayden, Laura Hinrichsen, who will moderate later with the questions, Claudia Perschmann, and Cornelia Weber. And I'm really very happy that we have been able to win Barbara Helwing, the directrice of the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, for this evening's lecture. She is certainly well known to most of you through her many years of archaeological fieldwork in Turkey, Iran, and Azerbaijan, and through her abundant publications. She worked in Iran for 2 decades, also as the head of the Tehran branch of the German Archaeological Institute, before moving to Lyon and Sydney as a professor. From there, she also curated the exhibition Iran Early Cultures Between Water and Desert that was shown in 2017 at the Bundeskunsthalle in Bonn. Now, in her lecture today, she summarizes the current state of archaeological research on the first cities in the Iranian highlands that emerged in the 3rd millennium BC as centers of trade and industries. Among these craft productions are intriguing examples of original imaginary, in particular in the field of chloride carving. The pictorial language of these objects represents the spiritual sphere of the time, taking us into a little-known imaginative world of myths and legends. And I'm very happy and welcome you to take this path guided by Barbara Helwing. Now, Barbara, please, the stage is yours. We are looking forward.
Thank you very much, Ute. Thank you very much to the whole team. And I try to share my screen immediately. Right. Yeah, so I'm very happy to contribute to this program, and I look forward to presenting to you a little bit of what we have learned over the last 20 and more years about early cities in Iran. I realized when questions came up that these early cities were not very clearly defined. So we are going to talk mainly about the Bronze Age here, even though the exhibition on five millennia of Iranian archaeology is, of course, extending well into later periods. So the first cities in Iran, what I hope to show you over the next 30, 40 minutes or so, is divided into 4 steps. A brief introduction to the landscape for those who do not know the country. I try to be brief on my overview also on where and when are the first cities. This is something that unfolds over 5 steps here, and I will take a little bit longer in step number 4 and step number 5 to also present a few of the finds. landscapes of, oh yeah, these are the 5 cycles of urbanization that I plan to show. And the 2 that are a little bit darker are those where I want to spend more time on them. But first, I want to start with a landscape. So on this map that deliberately doesn't show any borders or political zones, you can see the highlands of Iran as a mountainous area with a huge plateau in the middle. And this is what made Philip Smith, who is a Paleolithic and prehistoric archaeologist, to coin the term that Iran is like a donut, where everything that's pleasure is around it, and in the middle there's a big hole. This, in a way, is true when we look at cultural development. And so I thought this is a good starting point. And I want to point out, I'm not sure if you can see here my cursor, but I want to start here with the plains of Khuzestan as some of the foci of early cities, but I will spend the larger part of the talk in the very eastern part of Iran. So here, to be a bit more clear, we have the big mountains, the Alborz, the Zagros, and the Hindu Kush, and they are extremely important insofar as they are not only barriers, they are very often they are called barriers, but they are also places that store water, and so they function as buffers to any kind of human life and other life in the foothill zones. So where we will look at over this evening is mostly the river plains in and around the donut that is Iran. And to give you a few impressions, we are talking about really high mountain passes that separate individual valleys or individual landscapes, as you can see here. And at the same time, we have some of the hottest desert spots in the central parts of Iran. Here you see the salt pans of such a desert landscape. And it's in this desert landscape that we find many of the big Bronze Age cities, and you may wonder why this is the case. And the reason has a lot to do with changing climates and with the fact that the 4th and 3rd millennium were millennia of favorable climate, of enough precipitation coming down to turn these landscapes into fertile areas. So with these few impressions today, when you travel the landscape, you see that wherever there is water, they are extremely fertile. Wherever there is no water, it is very difficult to settle. And the developments of the few wetlands are really quite dramatic. And I show you here a sequence of 5 satellite images of Lake Hamoun. Lake Hamoun is the delta of the Helmand River that you had seen on one of the maps before. And you can see from 1976 to 1998, changing levels of water. And from the year 2000 onwards, on the right side, the last 2 images, the full drying up of this marshland and wetland due to the construction of dams on the upper Helmand River. So when we consider the landscape as a landscape for Bronze Age cities, we should always imagine that these were fertile areas, that they provided a lot of different natural resources for humans, for animals, and for plants. So just to give you a bit of a taste of the landscape. Now, I said that I plan to take you through these 5 different steps, and the first 3 will be very, very quick. So when we start in the late 5th millennium, we see a first cycle of emerging complexity. We see an increase in the size of settlements. We see an increased engagement in craft production, and we see the rise of political leaders or group leaders. And we have some very good recent finds. Here we have some very splendid graveyards recently excavated under the direction of Abbas Moghadam, very close to the edge of the Persian Gulf in Tole-Choga Sofla. And you see that this is mass burials, or it's burial, dolmen-like burials with numerous depositions of individuals inside. We have these fine stele showing a human face and animals on them. We have weaponry, and we have these nice little goblets that certainly relate to, funerary rituals of saying farewell to the deceased person. The goblet is important as it can be directly linked to goblets that are known since longer than a century from the excavations in Susa, where we did have another type of very splendid graveyard, but very little observation coming with it. It is estimated that in Susa, on the burial terrace, approximately 2,000 individuals had been buried. On the left, you see a reconstruction of one such burial with numerous vessels given to the dead person, plus some copper excess. And it is in this context that we see in the iconography of seals, stem seals mostly, now for the first time a figure in the center of the imagery that is taller than the others, that is apparently busy carrying out some ritual duties, and that is surrounded by minions in either adoring or working posture. As you can see here on this very well-known seal impression from Susa, and in a slightly different way on the right. And when we now look at the highlands of Iran, we can see at around the same time more stamp seal impressions, also showing such a central leading figure. They are a bit more schematic, but the system is pretty clear that we have this central personality here. One example from Hissa, another example from Gomrud, that replicate the same concept of a central leadership for the social group. So that would be a first cycle of increasing complexity. If we move on into the middle of the 4th millennium, this is the period when we see really in the south of Mesopotamia the formation of first social units that are really states, that have a paramount leader, that have large settlement complexes, including temples, etc. And what we find is this. We see a paramount figure here now in the seal impression, the so-called man in the netted skirt, performing ritual duties, but also collecting or punishing prisoners. Here on this seal impression that is stored in our museum, was excavated in Uruk. And we see that a lot of people are probably taken either prisoner or are being slaves of the one or other kind. And we have huge manufactures where people are put to work, as you can see on this small seal. All these people require feeding, and this needs to be centrally organized, as you can see here on the tablet, where we have a figure with a bowl. And these bowls that go in English by the name of beveled rim bowls are like the light fossil really for the Uruk period. In the highlands of Iran, we also find them, and we find them at very, very distant places. The whole plain of Khuzestan around Susa, Chogamish, Abu Fandove belongs into this realm of the Uruk world. But the feeding system, the centralized feeding system, is also replicated in distant places. Here in the Jiroft area at the site of Matutabad, we find the same type of beveled rim bowl. And even here up in Khorasan, in Kalekub, we find these kind of beveled rim bowls. So we see contacts. It's not the takeover of the complete system of the early states, but we see their repercussions in the highlands. And the next cycle here is what we would call the Proto-Elamite, starting from the last centuries of the 4th millennium and into the early 3rd millennium, develop sites that look like epigons of the previous Uruk period. We see a huge standardization of architecture and material culture. We have a strong centralization in place with only very few sites, but these are large. And we even see the development of a script, as we had seen in the Uruk before, but now with a different script, still not deciphered. And the site of Susa here is the one where we have the largest collection of such tablets with Proto-Elamite script. And I show you here on the left one excavated example from Susa. And there are altogether 11 sites in the highlands that also have evidence for these type of Proto-Elamite tablets. And this goes as far as the site of Tepe Yahya here in the Kerman province, and one single tablet was even found close to the Afghan border in Shari-Sukhte on the delta of the Helmand River. So from what content these tablets convey, we know that they are written to take notes of a centralized economy, like distributing cereals to workmen. So the concept is comparable to what we had before with the beveled rim bowls, but at a very, very small scale when it comes to the highlands. And this script lives not very long and is given up at the time when also most of these Proto-Elamite sites in the highlands are being abandoned. With the 3rd millennium, from approximately the 28th, 27th century onwards, we see a new quality in the formation of urban centers in Iran. And I want to look now mostly to the east of Iran, because in the western area, most sites are really very difficult to trace. Even the site of Susa has not very much in the sense of a settled occupation. We have graveyards, etc., but we do not have this large-scale architecture that we had seen before. All this is like a shift of the focus to the east. And this shift of the focus comes with the formation of real urban settlements with an internal diversification, functional diversification. We see the emergence of elite households, and all this is tied together in a network of long-distance contacts that colloquially very often goes by the name of Middle Asian Interaction Sphere, or abbreviated MICE. So for this, I show you a little bit more details. I mapped a lot of these sites, as you can see on this map, and there are clearly too many. So we are going to focus next here on the site of Tepe Yahya that I already mentioned, the site of Shari-Sukhte, and then we will turn to what is here in quotation marks, the area of Jiroft. We should also note that we are located, so this is here we have the Helmand Basin, here we have the Indus culture, we have Sumer and Susiana here to the left. So there are specific hotspots of urban settlement developing. Eastern Iran has been first explored by the famous archaeologist and traveler Aurel Stein, and he investigated and photographed and documented a lot of ancient archaeological sites in Eastern Iran since the 1920s. On this photograph, you see the site of Kona Sandal, that is by now better known as one of the major early Bronze Age centers in the Halil Rud Valley. And he also undertook excavations in a Bronze Age graveyard close to Bampur called Hurab. which I just show you to emphasize that the area has been under archaeological investigation since the 1920s. And it took then until the 1960s before excavations began in earnest. And we have two main expeditions that help us develop or establish a sort of sequence for the third millennium. One is the small but multi-period site of Tepe Yahya in Kerman province. Excavations since the late 1960s were directed by Karl Lamberg-Karlowski, and they have revealed a sequence from the Chalcolithic to the Bronze Age with interruptions in between. But in the later third millennium sequence, that is what is period 4B in Tepe Yahya, the so-called Persian Gulf room that you see a rather dark photograph on the right, revealed a lot of evidence for long-distance contacts going to the direction of the Persian Gulf. Among others, there was a seal excavated, which is the lower one on this slide. And it gives us some intriguing insights into a pantheon that is quite different from what we know from other places. You see a seated deity here. It's a deity because there is a horned crown on top. This deity has wings, and then there are adornants to the left and to the right. And the same or a similarly composed figure we also see on these other seals and seal impressions from the same archaeological contexts. So Yahya was very good to develop a sequence, an archaeological sequence, and we have here this 4B, 622, and 4B1 as representative units for the later third millennium. But the site that has really seen the largest and longest excavations is the site of Şarisuchte on the lower Helmand Basin. It has been visited also by Aurel Stein. Maurizio Tosi began excavations in the 1960s until revolution, and since 1997, Mansour Sajadi is excavating here. So it's probably the best explored site in the whole region and the most long-term explored site in the whole region. In 2013, UNESCO declared the site a World Heritage Site. And what you see here in this quite splendid aerial photograph taken by Georg Gerster is a view of this extended ruin that expands for approximately 200 hectares into the landscape. And mapping shows us here that there is a lot of functional differentiation of the various quarters of this city. So the 200 hectares we are seeing here are divided into what's called here the city area and the northwestern quarters, and then places with a lot of workshop debris for the working of lapis lazuli, of copper, of alabaster, and many other things. So on the right, just an overview of some of this large-scale architecture exposed from the middle to the later third millennium, and a few detailed views here. From the early excavations, a segment of a house called House of the Jars, and you see that this has a central room really with a sort of central hearth, and is then surrounded by a lot of individual units where storage vessels, etc., are located. You can also see that there is staircases, so we should probably reconstruct all these houses as two-story houses. From the recent excavations by Mansour Sajadi and his team, a large building, it's just giving you a few examples of how the architecture looks like there. Area 20 is a large building with two central places with central hearth, and it is interpreted as a temple because the walls are very nicely plastered and are colored with red, and also these central hearths may stand as the places where communal or commensal consumption of some food would take place. Finally, from the early excavations dating to the very end of to the latest occupation phase in Şarisuhte, the so-called burned building. And this is clearly an elite building with numerous places for storage, large ovens, and workshops all together. On the left, an isometric reconstruction of this building. Şarisuhte altogether has a large graveyard area, as you could see on the map before, and it is estimated that there should be something in the range between 20 and 30,000 burials originally on the site. From excavating these, there is also, of course, an enormous amount of finds. Among others, these piriform goblets and, well, other kinds of vessels, but also lapis lazuli, alabaster, and other fine materials were buried with the people. So the two sites give us a pretty good overview on the third millennium material culture. They are several hundred kilometers apart, so they do not represent the same local culture, but the same overall system. And from connecting the various materials that were worked in Şarisuhte and in Yahya and in other places, close to sources of alabaster, for example, or lapis lazuli, it was reconstructed that all these third millennium sites are bound together in a huge interaction system or trade system that finally funnels a lot of fine materials to Sumer. And to illustrate this, I show you here an image from a reconstructed burial from the famous royal cemetery of Ur. And then came the Giroft discovery. It's a bit less than 20 years ago that a massive question or a massive story of looting ancient graveyards started in the valley of the Halil route south of Kerman, and in 2003 this material was announced by the antiquities administration after several hundreds of these objects had been confiscated by the local police. So these were quite stunning objects. They were carved from chloride. They had a very intriguing imagery on them, and they were popping up on the arts market in the hundreds. And I just show you here a few of the headlines. It seemed to be totally enigmatic, which in fact it was not. It was a very short period of intensive graveyard looting in the Halil Root Valley that had started only from 2000 onwards. And as you can see on the left in this photograph of one of these graveyards, this activity devastates the sites and the archaeological archives completely. It was the Iranian archaeologist Youssef Majid-Zadeh who took upon himself the challenge to really try and document what was left. And he also started excavation in a site called Kona Sandal, the same site that I showed you Aurel Stein's photograph before, and to start develop a sort of archaeological sequence for this period. You have him here on the right in this slide. However, this discovery of this of the Giroft, so-called Giroft chloride vessels, was just very stunning, and it took a lot of imagination or I took let's say, a vivid life in public imagination, as you can see on the right, on this advertisement that I photographed in 2015 in Kerman. In 2017, for the first time, we could bring a small selection of these objects to Bonn, to the Bundeskunsthalle, and put them on exhibition. So they are now fairly well known. But they are not as enigmatic as they seem to be here, because the Tepe Yahya excavations had already documented workshops for this kind of carved chloride vessels. So they can be pretty well located here in the last centuries of, or the second third of the third millennium BCE. And I want to show you a few of these images, because they give us an intriguing insight into the world as such, as it was perceived of in this region. You see here, for example, two examples of views of a city. So it is like the facade of a city wall with houses with these sagging lintels, and in here you even have some sort of a stepped, potentially tower, which would be something that is known from the wider area for the later periods. We also find systematically an imagery of fertility. So images of palm trees certainly stand for the fertility of the landscape, and we have other images signifying abundance from a landscape thriving with wild game. Or on the left, this is one of these goblets just in three different views, where you see a hero leading two water buffaloes with his hands, and there is water flowing from between the horns of these water buffaloes. So water, fertility are big themes in here. Another recurrent motif are combat scenes. You see on the left two views of one goblet showing us a hero. The left one shows us the hero as a sort of hybrid creature with the legs of a bull and a human body. And this hero is fighting with leopards, the same on the right, more or less the same picture, and combined with scorpions. The combat theme also occurs between animals only. The leopard is always one party here, and the serpent is his adversary. So again, very, let's say, stereotypical combination of these animals. And finally, an animal that is often shown with the wings wide open, splayed wings, is a vulture, a bearded vulture actually, here holding on to two serpents. It's very often described as an eagle, but you can very clearly see here that this is a bearded, the beak has a beard, as it is in an original bearded vulture. And you see the same here, so very clearly this is a vulture. A specialty of the area are these game boards that are carved also from chloride, or in Charisuchte we also know them made from wood. And then there are all kinds of other interesting materials coming from the same looted graveyards that have here lapis lazuli carved discs, and there's copper work and there's alabaster work, etc. So this is a bit of a tour de force through some of the find complexes of the last years. But what is really the consequence of this discovery is a new image of how to reconstruct the trade, because we can see that all these hundreds and hundreds of chloride vessels that have so far, when they were found, they were always described as being luxury goods made for the export to Mesopotamia. But in fact, they are consumed locally. They are part of the local graveyards, and they are not in their, at least not in the first place, produced for export. And this kind of confirms a model of not just trade, but of interaction between these individual valleys, the valley of the Halil route, where this giraffe area is located, the Helmand Valley with Shari-Suchte, the Indus Valley, and then further to the north, Khorasan and Turkmenistan areas. So all these seem to be very closely connected by exchanging some of their rather splendid materials, but they are not all just producing for the consumption in Mesopotamia. And if I have time, I would also give you an impression of what comes next, because there is a major seizure after the 23rd century. So this thriving network and matrix of interconnected early Bronze Age cities turns because, well, for a couple of reasons. There is a shift to the north. The sites in the south seem to come to an end, and we do have chronological problems there, but there is definitely a shift to the north. And at the same time, the Akkadian and later Ur III armies from Mesopotamia start to target the highlands. And this kind of brings the whole balance into a new form, which we can see here with the famous Naram-Sin stele standing for these continuous attacks against the highlands. And we see the shift from, we had Yahya, Shari-Suchte, and Giraffe area before, and now we see a new center emerging up here in Turkmenistan, in Gorno-Tepe, and in Tepe Hissar on the one hand, and in Shahdad on the other hand. We see that these sites were in contact with what we see here up in the north. So a few images of Shahdad, which is right on the edge of the Lut Desert and must have been an oasis-like fertile area in the Bronze Age, where we do have evidence for a large extended settlement comparable to Shari-Suchte. As you can see here, huge buildings for extended households and extended graveyards as well. So Shahdad is also mostly known for materials from the graveyards. Among others, we do have here these figures, 29 altogether excavated, that are made from clay and in a sort of praying position are set up in these graves. We have a further developed iconography in the seals with deities here seated with signs of fertilities like cereals sprouting from their shoulders. And then we also have, besides the anthropomorphic deities, now we also have imagery here of human leaders on this very famous standard from Ur, which is a copper standard looking like a flag on a pole, where we have a paramount leader once more seated and toasting with some smaller figures here. The second site is Tepe Hissar, where we have a huge elite residence called also a burned building, and then extended graveyards around, where we find all kinds of very interesting find materials. Here a few figurative objects, and I want to draw your attention mostly to the alabaster idols. Then all kinds of serving vessels that seem to mimic metal, and then very richly equipped grave inventories with gold appliques, and on the left here in a drawing from the old excavation report from 1937, gold foil, carnelian, etc. all together. And also one interesting and optically not very fascinating object is this one. This is a trumpet, and the trumpet is one of the key, or one of the light fossils, you could say, for the South Turkmenian Bronze Age cities. And on the right here, you have some of these appliques that are sewn onto clothes and are found in these graves. Other material here is more alabaster, these kind of small biconical columns here on the right that are found all around the Hindu Kush. And these kind of discs are also frequently found. Their purpose is not so clear, but they seem to be related to some cultic function. And the new center where all this seems to relate to is located in South Turkmenistan, in the delta of the Murghab River and along the Amudarya River. So it goes by the name of Bactrian Margiana archaeological complex, or Oxus civilization. So this is the two different rivers. And here we have huge settlements. Once more, we have very, very rich graves. And among those of you who live in Berlin, the Margiana exhibition a few years ago, brought together by the Museum for Vor- und Frühgeschichte, has very nicely given insight into this rich culture that really begins in earnest in the 23rd century BCE. So we have deities with wings here on a stamp seal, which is closely comparable to the figure we have seen on one of the Schachtat seals, and then very famous from this area and only rarely from excavation and many more from looted graveyards are these composite figures of seated ladies carved from chlorite and alabaster. That these centers in the Murghab and Amudarya area were connected in a wide trade network is clear. We also now have good evidence for the existence of domesticated camels here on a silver vessel excavated in Gonur Tepe, but we had this before from the zoological record. So we can say that, just bringing it back together, Schachtat here, Tepe Hisar, both have materials connecting them to the area with Gonur Tepe as the major center, so the Murghab River and the Amudarya on this side. And here we have a new hotspot of urban development, whereas here in the south, one by one, these settlements seem to be given up, at least the large ones, and the reason may be also a drying up of climate in time. So to pull this together, we have a continuous development of occupation in place since the Chalcolithic. There is on and off contacts with models, state models of early centralized institutions in the Uruk period, and then again in the Proto-Elamite period. We have a flourishing network of elites that are inhabiting these huge settlements like Shari-Suchte in what we call the Middle Asian interaction sphere. And it is at this time that we see the original iconography of the chlorite vessels, where we have fertility, heroes, and the forces of nature being staged. we know from historical sources and the archaeology that conflicts and raids with lowland forces like the Akkadian army and later also the Ur-3 rulers changed this balance from the 23rd century onwards. At the same time, probably for reasons of climatic changes, we see a decline of the sites on the southern side of the Hindu Kush and an emergence of the new centers like Gonur Tepe north of the Hindu Kush. And this seems also to correlate in time with the beginning of a trade in bulk goods, among which tin is a major asset, and there is tin sources not very far from the Oxus and Bactrian Margiana area. And we also can consider that these early empires then had a lot to do with the raising of animals and the provisioning of raw materials like wool. And this is why I wish to conclude by coming up or bringing again this nice applique in gold that you have seen in the beginning. And thank you for your patience.
Yes, thank you very much, Barbara, indeed, for this fascinating talk, bringing together and trying to link so various regional and cultural landscapes and bringing them into a chronological and evolutionary perspective. I can see that there are already some questions from the audience, and since you have kept perfectly in time, we have enough time for some discussion. So I will present you the questions now. I don't know if you can see them. The first one was
I can.
Diana. You can?
I can. If this facilitates things, I can read them and answer them directly, whatever you prefer.
Yes, please, that's the easiest.
And Diana Dark asked if there has been an attempt made to connect this with Göbekli Tepe and other similar sites in southeast Turkey near the Syrian border. Actually, no. And to be honest, I don't see that we can connect them because we are approximately 6,000 years apart. So the sites like Göbekli Tepe that are from the transition to sedentism, that are basically hunter-gatherer gathering places and ritual places, are then followed by societies that that use agriculture, etc. And all these early symbols are not preserved in the imagery that we see following on Göbekli Tepe, and I would not sustain that for 6,000 years this knowledge kind of lies dormant. I would say that we should consider this independently.
Okay, thank you. There is another question which has an equally wide range. You can see it in the chat again by Jongmin Lee.
So Jongmin Lee has two questions. One is the question if the winged deities, I'm not quite sure if I understand this correct, if they influence the iconography of angels in Judaism and Christianity. We can only speculate about this. Again, we are 2,000 years before that. We do have in seal iconography in Mesopotamia, we time and again have images of winged creatures. So there is certainly a connection with wings, but how this enters really the iconography of Judaism and Christianity is a question that I think we cannot easily answer. For the vultures, I would turn the question around. The early reception of the giraffe vessels was very often referring to the Anzu bird in Mesopotamian iconography, and therefore this raptor was immediately considered to be an eagle, which it isn't. So I think it's a different story behind the icon or behind the image of the birded vulture, because the birded vultures are known to feed on bones. So they are probably, I would say they are most probably associated with death, and maybe with sanitizing an area of death, and maybe being messengers between worlds of the living and the dead. So if we consider all these chloride vessels to come from graves, the bearded vulture in there certainly must have a meaning as potentially being a messenger to this other world.
Thank you. And are there any further questions from the audience? If at present no, Barbara, I would like to ask you a question. And that is something that has intrigued me very much after the giraffe finds were made public, and the wide range of stylistic variety and fascinating imagery became known. Of course, we had known about, as you also said, about the chloride vessels from the excavations at Tepe Yahya and finds further in the eastern sites. But what was produced at Tepe Yahya in the workshops, it really was just a very limited view into that, mostly one type of depiction. Now, with the new evidence, we have so many different themes and also different styles in carving and producing in the vessels, that I wonder, is there any evidence from the excavations and from the tombs or from related finds that there is some kind of chronology involved, or are there different workshops that have been identified?
So, you know, I'm a hardcore prehistoric archaeologist and not an art historical archaeologist. So I would refer to Holly Pittman, who is one of the best the people knowing these collections best, and who has also published a lot of these materials and systematized them. So Holly Pittman is convinced that there are different workshops involved. There are very different styles indeed. There must be a chronological component, yes, but maybe not as, I mean, there is one with the really much later production that are very often small chloride vessels, like coal containers in the shape of a little house or so. But these massive production that we find in the giraffe looted graveyards still has very different styles in them. So I think a way forward would be to source the chlorides, to figure out if there is, to figure out if we can locate specific sources that link to specific styles, and that would confirm the existence of different workshops. But chronologically, I think this period that I tried to bring together between 2,800, 700 down to 2,300, this is like the heydays of producing these vessels.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very welcome.
There's another question, or actually two questions that have come in. One is from Nina. Can you see the question, Nina Batebi?
Yes. So Nina Batebi asks, about the Arose mountain range, that there are cities related to prehistoric times in Laridjan and Bandepi. I have to confess that I'm not familiar with the research of Dr. Saman Touafik of high elevation sites. The question is, or it's not really a question, it's a statement that there are settlements at an altitude of 3,000 meters above sea level with stone totems and idols. I wonder if this refers potentially to the sites of Meskin Shah, where we do have fields of anthropomorphic stele. So this would be in Ardabil province in a very cold and high and very harsh environment. But there we are in the Iron Age, and that would be like the very end of the second and the early first millennium. So I'm not sure how to make the connection with this question. I'm sorry about that. And Jongmin Lee asks again if there's a relation with iconography of Hathor and Isis in Egypt. This is something we cannot exclude. We should consider the Persian Gulf as a major line of traffic and contact. And of course, this would also reach all the way around the Arabian Peninsula into the Red Sea. So I would not claim that they are not in contact, but how one influences the other still is something we cannot at this point decipher.
Okay, thank you very much. If we don't have any further questions, we could end the presentation and the discussion perfectly in time. And what I feel is a real deficit of a digital presentation is that we cannot really give you a clap, so that you cannot get applause from the audience. But I think I'm speaking for all if we give a to you and yeah,
there are hands coming up on the side.
Hands are
yeah,
coming up. Thank
nice.
you. Great.
Thank you. Very kind of you. It was a pleasure, and I wish I could present all this in much more detail, but that would be difficult.
Yeah, maybe we find another solution for that. It would really, I think, need to be a weekend's workshop or something.
We should do that. Thank you to all.
Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again today in the week for the next lecture, which will be by Ina Sarihani on modern art in Iran. And I wish you a happy evening and nice evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye to all. Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.